What could make a veteran Republican senator amid a hearing riven by the year's sharpest partisan divide? Mouth thank you to Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett on live television. The marble hall of the Senate Judiciary Committee fell abruptly silent as Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii stepped to the microphone. A joint hearing on judicial reform, forecast as a bare-knuckle clash, suddenly veered off script. A behind-the-scenes story of persistence in the pursuit of justice was about to come to light, the kind no camera had managed to capture. Until now. "Before I begin my questioning," Schatz said, his voice warm yet unusually emotional, "I want to acknowledge something that very few in this room, and almost no one watching at home, knows." Lawmakers leaned in. The cameras settled on the dais. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat calmly among her House colleagues. "Congresswoman Crockett," Schatz continued, "over the past 3 months, your work to secure justice for the forgotten families in the Marshall Islands case represents the highest standard of public service this body has ever witnessed." What he said next, detailing Crockett's quiet, credit-averse work, prompted spontaneous, bipartisan applause that broke every protocol in the room. In that moment, viewers glimpsed a different Congress, a place where legal precision and steadfast, unglamorous effort can still calm the waves of confrontation, allowing a single "thank you" to land with more weight than any pre-written speech. If you want more stories like this, where knowledge and composure stand toe-to-toe with raw power, hit subscribe and join our community at Jasmine Crockett File. We bring you political moments that not only shock, but inspire. The Joint Judiciary Committee hearing had been convened to address what many considered an intractable partisan issue: proposed reforms to the federal judiciary following several controversial Supreme Court decisions. With the Senate and House Judiciary Committees meeting together in the larger Senate chamber, the atmosphere was tense with anticipated partisan conflict. Senator Brian Schatz brought a particular perspective to the proceedings. The Hawaii Democrat, first appointed to the Senate in 2012 following Senator Daniel Inouye's death and subsequently elected in his own right, had built a reputation as a thoughtful progressive who occasionally found common ground with Republican colleagues on specific issues. His interest in judicial reform stemmed partly from his state's unique legal history, with Native Hawaiian rights and historical injustices frequently intersecting with federal court jurisdictions. Before entering politics, Schatz had worked in the nonprofit sector and served in Hawaii's state legislature, developing expertise in environmental policy and indigenous rights. While not a lawyer himself, he had become known on the Judiciary Committee for his thorough preparation and focus on practical impacts rather than abstract legal theories. What do you think about representatives who work across party lines on justice issues? Is bipartisanship still possible in today's divided Congress? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We value your perspective on finding common ground in polarized times. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett represented a different path to the halls of Congress. Elected in 2022 to represent Texas's 30th congressional district, she had previously established herself as a formidable civil rights attorney with extensive courtroom experience. Her legal background gave her particular credibility on judiciary matters, though as a first-term representative, she was still establishing her legislative reputation. What most observers didn't know, and what would soon be revealed, was that Crockett had been working quietly behind the scenes on an issue that technically fell outside her committee assignments, but aligned deeply with her commitment to justice. The Marshall Islands case, as it had become known in legal circles, involved approximately 300 families who had suffered decades of health impacts following American nuclear testing in the Pacific from 1946 to 1958. Despite a settlement agreement in the 1980s, new evidence had emerged showing that the U.S. government had concealed the full extent of radiation exposure, leaving many victims without proper compensation for cancers and genetic disorders that continued to affect multiple generations. The legal complexities were daunting. The original settlement included language that appeared to prevent future claims, regardless of new evidence. The statute of limitations had long expired under conventional interpretations. Multiple presidential administrations, both Republican and Democratic, had maintained that the matter was legally closed despite the new evidence. For the affected families, many now living in Hawaii, Arkansas, and several other states, justice had remained elusive. Their stories, children born with developmental disabilities, unusually high cancer rates, and continuing health problems, had occasionally generated sympathetic media coverage, but little concrete action. Both Democratic and Republican administrations had cited the finality of the original settlement and the complexity of reopening decades-old claims. What no one in the public sphere knew was that Congresswoman Crockett, whose district included none of the affected families, had become involved after a chance meeting with a Marshall Islander community advocate during a layover at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. Moved by their story and recognizing the legal injustice, she had quietly begun investigating potential legislative remedies. The Joint Committee hearing that day had nothing officially to do with the Marshall Islands case. It focused instead on proposed structural reforms to the federal judiciary, term limits for Supreme Court justices, ethics standards for federal judges, and court expansion proposals. These topics reliably generated partisan division, with each side accusing the other of seeking to weaponize the courts for political advantage. As the hearing began, it followed predictable patterns. Republican senators and representatives emphasized the importance of judicial independence and the dangers of politically motivated reforms. Democratic members highlighted recent ethics controversies and argued for structural changes to ensure the judiciary's legitimacy. C-SPAN cameras captured the increasingly tense exchanges, with committee members falling into familiar partisan positions. Political observers watching the live stream anticipated nothing beyond the usual performative confrontation that characterized most congressional hearings on divisive topics. When Senator Schatz's turn for questioning arrived, most expected him to focus on judicial term limits, which he had previously supported. Instead, his unexpected acknowledgement of Congresswoman Crockett's work on an entirely different matter would transform the hearing and reveal a story of quiet dedication that transcended the partisan theatrics that typically dominated Capitol Hill. "Before I begin my questioning," Senator Schatz said, his voice measured but filled with unusual emotion, "I want to acknowledge something that few in this room and virtually no one watching at home is aware of." The gathered senators and representatives shifted in their seats, expressions curious. C-SPAN cameras panned across the dais, where Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat among her House colleagues, her face revealing nothing. "Congresswoman Crockett," Schatz continued, "your work over the past 3 months to secure justice for the forgotten families in the Marshall Islands case represents the finest tradition of public service this body has ever witnessed." The chamber grew quieter still. Most committee members appeared confused, unfamiliar with either Crockett's involvement or the case itself. For those unaware, Schatz explained, the Marshall Islands nuclear testing legacy represents one of America's unresolved injustices. From 1946 to 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands, with a total yield equivalent to 1.6 Hiroshima bombs every day for 12 years. He continued, his voice solemn. While a settlement was reached decades ago, Recently declassified documents revealed that our government knowingly concealed the full extent of radiation exposure from both the courts and the affected families. The legal barriers to remedy seemed insurmountable until Congresswoman Crockett became involved. Senator Chuck Grassley, the senior Republican on the committee, leaned forward with evident interest. Several other Republican members exchanged glances, clearly hearing this information for the first time. 3 months ago, Schatz continued, Congresswoman Crockett learned of this injustice through a chance encounter with community advocates. Despite having no affected constituents in her district and no personal connection to the issue, she recognized a fundamental injustice that transcended politics. Schatz then revealed what Crockett had accomplished behind the scenes. Working nights and weekends, she developed a novel legal framework to address the statute of limitations barriers. She personally researched declassified documents that others had overlooked. Most remarkably, she drafted legislative language that satisfied both Justice Department concerns about precedent and the legitimate needs of affected families. The chamber remained silent as Schatz described Crockett's work in more detail. What makes her efforts truly extraordinary is that she sought no credit. She didn't issue press releases or social media posts. She worked across party lines, building quiet consensus rather than public attention. Schatz looked directly at Crockett. Congresswoman, I know you didn't want this acknowledgement. You told me repeatedly that this wasn't about you, but about securing justice for families who had waited generations. But the American people should know that while cameras focus on our disagreements, dedicated public servants like you are doing the unglamorous work of justice behind the scenes. He held up a document. This amendment, which will be attached to the appropriations bill next week, will finally provide health care and compensation to 300 families affected by radiation exposure. It has 18 Republican and 22 Democratic co-sponsors in the Senate, and similar bipartisan support in the House. This achievement, bridging decades of inaction and partisan division, would not exist without your legal expertise, moral commitment, and willingness to work without recognition. What happened next broke all protocols of congressional hearings. Senator Grassley, the 89-year-old Republican who had served in Congress since 1975, stood up and began to applaud. Within seconds, members from both parties joined in spontaneous applause that filled the chamber. C-SPAN cameras captured the extraordinary moment. Partisan divisions temporarily set aside in recognition of genuine public service dedicated to justice rather than political advantage. Several Republican senators could be seen mouthing thank you toward Crockett, while her Democratic colleagues appeared both surprised and moved by this unexpected bipartisan acknowledgement. When the applause finally subsided, Congresswoman Crockett addressed the committee with characteristic humility. Thank you, Senator Schatz. But this recognition belongs to the families who never gave up seeking justice and to staff members from both parties who worked tirelessly on this solution. She continued, her voice steady but emotion evident. This wasn't about politics, but about our nation keeping its promises. The affected families never asked for special treatment, only for acknowledgement of the full truth and appropriate health care for ongoing conditions. I'm grateful that colleagues from both parties recognize that some injustices transcend our political differences. Senator John Kennedy, a Louisiana Republican known for his conservative positions, spoke next. Congresswoman Crockett, I want to thank you personally. My state has a community of Marshall Islanders who have suffered health effects for generations. They had given up hope of ever receiving justice from their government. Your work represents what Congress should be, but too rarely is. This additional acknowledgement from a conservative Republican further highlighted the extraordinary nature of the moment. The partisan tension that had defined the hearing's earlier exchanges had transformed into something rarely seen in contemporary congressional proceedings: genuine appreciation across party lines for substantive work addressing a long-standing injustice. As questioning returned to the hearing's official topic of judicial reform, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The revelation of Crockett's behind-the-scenes work had reminded everyone present that beyond the cameras and partisan performance, the real work of governance sometimes happened through quiet dedication to justice rather than public confrontation. Senator Schatz concluded his time by noting, "Perhaps the lesson here is that justice doesn't always come through dramatic confrontation or viral moments. Sometimes it comes through meticulous legal research, patient coalition building, and a willingness to work without public recognition." Congresswoman Crockett has demonstrated that such work still happens in these halls, even when cameras and headlines focus elsewhere. As the hearing continued for the day, the impact of Senator Schatz's revelation and the spontaneous applause for Congresswoman Crockett extended beyond the committee room. Congressional staffers were already sharing the C-SPAN clip across social media platforms, with the hashtag #QuietJustice beginning to trend on Twitter. What made the moment particularly powerful was its authenticity. In an era of carefully choreographed political moments, this spontaneous recognition had caught everyone, including Crockett herself, by surprise. The genuine nature of the acknowledgement from members of both parties resonated with a public increasingly cynical about performative politics. During a brief recess, reporters gathered around both Senator Schatz and Congresswoman Crockett, seeking additional details about the Marshall Islands case and the unusual bipartisan cooperation it had generated. "Congresswoman," asked a CNN correspondent, "why did you choose to work on this issue when it doesn't directly affect your district? And why did you pursue it without publicity?" Crockett's response reflected the same commitment to substance over performance that had characterized her behind-the-scenes work. "Justice doesn't stop at district boundaries," she explained. "When I learned about these families, some of whom have waited 3 generations for proper health care and acknowledgement, the legal injustice was clear, regardless of politics." Regarding her decision to work without publicity, she added, "Some issues benefit from public attention and pressure. Others require quiet, detailed work to build consensus. This case involved sensitive, declassified information and complex legal barriers. Making it a public fight might have created defensive posturing that prevented solution. The families deserve results, not just advocacy." Senator Grassley, approached by Fox News, offered his perspective on why Republicans had joined the effort. "This wasn't about expanding government or creating new entitlements," the conservative Republican explained. "This was about America keeping its word and acknowledging documented facts." The declassified evidence Congresswoman Crockett uncovered showed clear government knowledge that hadn't been disclosed during the original settlement negotiations. That's not a partisan issue. That's basic fairness. As the hearing resumed, something remarkable happened. Members from both parties began referencing the Marshall Islands case as a model for how Congress could approach other challenging issues through detailed factual investigation, legal precision, and cross-party coalition building rather than public confrontation. Senator Tom Tillis, a North Carolina Republican, noted during his questioning, "The approach Congresswoman Crockett took on the Marshall Islands case, focusing on documented facts and legal principles rather than partisan framing, might serve as a model for how we should approach judicial reform as well. Perhaps we need more careful examination of specific problems and targeted solutions rather than sweeping ideological positions." This suggestion represented a significant shift in the discussion's tenor. Several subsequent speakers from both parties similarly referenced the Marshall Islands resolution as a potential template for addressing at least some aspects of judicial reform through bipartisan cooperation. During an afternoon recess, C-SPAN cut away from the dais to voices that have lived this history. Marshall Islander community leaders stepped before the cameras to explain why the amendment Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett helped craft mattered so much. For decades, we were told this was legally impossible, said Maria Kabua, whose grandmother was exposed to radiation during the Pacific tests. Multiple administrations insisted the original settlement was final, no matter what new evidence showed. What Crockett did, Kabua explained, was locate a narrow but sturdy path, a legal route that respected precedent while acknowledging newly declassified documents, records indicating what the government knew and did not disclose during the original negotiations. Another leader, James Likia, spoke to the deeper human need. What meant the most to our families wasn't just health care and compensation, he said. It was the acknowledgement of the full truth. The amendment, he noted, includes formal recognition that crucial information about radiation exposure had been withheld during the initial settlement process. That explicit acknowledgement, historical truth on the record, carries weight in communities that have felt unseen for generations. As those interviews aired, the social media conversation pivoted. The day had begun with the usual volleys over court reform. By late afternoon, feeds were filled with threads about the Marshall Islands case itself. Many viewers were encountering the story for the first time, its history, the newly surfaced documents, and the quiet bipartisan work that finally cracked open a door, long thought sealed. Major outlets followed fast. The Washington Post published a detailed timeline tracing how declassified files showed government scientists understood radiation levels in areas later declared safe for resettlement. The New York Times interviewed legal scholars about the novel way Crockett's approach addressed statute of limitations hurdles in cases where evidence had been deliberately withheld. The picture that emerged wasn't one of theatrics. It was the slow burn of methodical, document-driven lawmaking. As one scholar told NPR, what Congresswoman Crockett accomplished didn't come from grandstanding. It came from meticulous research that found a path acceptable to justice officials worried about precedent and to families facing ongoing health impacts. It's a model for how legal craft can solve problems that political positioning can't. When the hearing adjourned for the day, Chairman Dick Durbin offered an unusual coda, a reminder that the best of Congress doesn't play to the camera. It depends on facts, law, and the human stakes, often far from the Klieg lights. His remarks captured what Senator Brian Schatz's acknowledgement and the spontaneous applause that followed had already demonstrated. A session expected to calcify partisan trenches had instead exposed the quieter, sturdier architecture of public service. The ripple traveled beyond the room. In the days and weeks that followed, coverage dug deeper, into the injustice itself and the behind-the-scenes coalition Crockett built. The Associated Press reported that she spent recesses traveling to Arkansas and Hawaii to meet directly with affected families, gathering medical documentation without press conferences. The Los Angeles Times revealed that she sought a temporary subcommittee assignment to gain jurisdictional footing on compensation issues, even though the case did not touch her district. And a 60-minute segment showed the sequence that opened Republican doors, not a pitch, but a dossier. Declassified records and family testimony laid down first, with policy talk second. 1 week after the hearing, the amendment passed with overwhelming bipartisan margins, 91-9 in the Senate, 382-53 in the House. The president signed it into law at a ceremony attended by affected families and members from both parties. The statute established specialized health care for radiation-related conditions, compensation for documented cases, and, crucially, an official statement that key information had been withheld during the original settlement. At the signing, Alaska's Senator Lisa Murkowski put the point plain. Success came because the case was framed not as a political cudgel, but as a human obligation, backed by facts, legal analysis, and testimony strong enough to cross party lines. For families, the change was concrete and deeply felt. Care for conditions that had burdened generations, and the dignity of a public record corrected at last. For Congress, the episode seeded a broader conversation about effectiveness. Political scientists noted how Crockett's method diverged from the performance model that dominates modern politics. Work first, cameras later, if at all. Build the factual spine, meet the people affected, anticipate objections, and answer them in the bill text. And where possible, lead with shared values, not partisan frames. Georgetown University convened a symposium, Beyond Partisan Performance, with the Marshall Islands case at its center. Professor Jennifer Lawless called it a roadmap for legislating in a polarized era. Meticulous fact development, legal precision, and values-based coalition building that opened space for bipartisan cooperation on issues with clear moral dimension. Hill staff workshops followed, mapping the strategies that moved the amendment from impossible to inevitable. Document before publicity, engage communities directly, draft to address cross-pressures, frame in terms of fairness, duty, and truth. Newsrooms adjusted, too. While conflict still led, more coverage highlighted the maintenance work of governing, the bipartisan fixes, the targeted bills that rarely trend but meaningfully change lives. It wasn't a media revolution, but the aperture widened. For Jasmine Crockett, recognition brought both opportunity and restraint. Invitations rolled in. Law schools, community groups, policy institutes, asking her to speak about coalition building that begins with evidence, not headlines. Clinicians folded the Marshall Islands case into systemic justice curricula. Yet when asked at Harvard Law School how the attention had changed things, Crockett redirected the lens. The value of that moment, she said, is the room it creates to tackle other long-stalled injustices. Toxic exposure for veterans, infrastructure gaps in rural America, issues that might yield to the same method. Thorough documentation, clear legal architecture, and coalitions grounded in shared commitments. She put it simply. The meaningful outcome isn't personal acclaim, it's seeing the model travel. Members from both parties had already approached her about applying it elsewhere. That, she argued, is the legacy, evidence that governance can still function across division when it begins with facts and shared values rather than posture and performance. Months later, Senator Schatz reflected on the applause that started it all. The power of the moment, he said, wasn't only in the policy victory. It was in the process the room briefly chose to honor. In an age dominated by performative conflict, members recognized the unglamorous craft. Research, drafting, quiet persuasion. That makes durable change possible. Acknowledging that work mattered precisely because it is so often invisible. The public seemed to notice, a year on. A Pew survey found that nearly 2/3 of Americans believed lawmakers who pursued detailed solutions without chasing publicity are more effective than those focused on media visibility. It wasn't an overnight conversion, but it suggested an electorate more open to valuing the work done between viral moments, the space where, more often than not, governing actually happens. As political scientist Norman Ornstein observed, that standing ovation signaled more than praise for one member on one issue. It marked a collective recognition that beneath the dysfunction, there remain public servants capable of advancing justice through detail, discipline, and decency. The fact that such work still happens, and sometimes, briefly, takes center stage, is reason enough to keep faith. Share your thoughts below. I read every comment, and I'd love to hear from you. If this resonated, please like, share, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next story. And before you go, check out the featured video on your screen. I'm especially proud of that one. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you next time. Jasmine Crockett File.